over to Laura. So Laura, please take it away.
Good afternoon. I come to you today from Lincoln, Nebraska, actually, so a little bit south of my border. And we kind of have a lot of material to go through this month. There's kind of a lot of updates to mention. So first of all, I'll start with some recent flooding there in the picture you see in the Chicago area. Some really heavy rainfall they had just recently over the weekend. I'll show some numbers on that, but there's a picture there from the Naperville area and DuPage River. All right, just some introductory notes here that this is really a collaborative effort, not just with myself and NOAA and Doug Cluck, but the USDA Climate Hubs, our regional climate centers, and a handful of others. We do this webinar the third Thursday every month, so there will be another one coming up in November. The presenter is still to be announced, but that will come up. And there are a couple places there too where you can access the past webinars and continue registering if you want to point people that direction for any future ones. All right, so kind of a note on the order of how I'll talk about things today. First, looking at recent conditions, touching a little bit on impacts, but I'll leave the agriculture impacts to Brad in the next presentation, and then going to the Outlook section. And there on the right, you see just one picture of soybean harvest there north of Sioux Falls area just recently. I believe over just the last week she took that picture. All right, so just a quick look back towards the month of September, looking at temperature to start with. This is how each state ranked as far as a historical perspective on average temperature. And you'll see handful of our states, Wisconsin, Michigan especially, are much above average, not quite in the record territory out of 123 years of record. But most of the rest of the states in this north central region, we're above average for temperature for that month of September. Looking at the growing season overall, just to quickly show this, that was pretty consistent across the region as well, not just in September, but looking at April through September overall. Some of the central and southern states were closer to average, but the northern states were warmer than average for the 6-month period or so, April through September of this year. Montana, obviously, with some of the extreme drought that they've had this year, sticks out very clearly as much above average. Looking at precipitation ranks here, again, just for the month of September right here, you can see areas that were above average and below average in the region, kind of a west-east divide, so to speak, as we had Wyoming 112 out of 123 years of record, but Missouri and Illinois and Michigan, ranking 5 out of 123 years. So quite extremes from west to east across the region. And then taking a little longer look back, again, the growing season overall from April through September. Again, these are from NOAA and NCEI. The drought areas of Montana and North Dakota sure show up very clearly as below average precipitation for the season overall. And Iowa there too, as well, as if you guys have been watching the drought, they did have some severe drought area come up in that state as well, but more above average across much of the eastern part of the region. All right, focusing on just the last 30 days, that I just showed you just the September and the growing season so far, focusing really just the last 30 days, so September 17th to October 16th. And this is actually, it looks like it might be an average temperature map, but it's not. This is actually the departure or difference from average temperature, where the western side of the region here really was cooler than average, and the east side much warmer than average. I'll show some kind of interesting numbers from the heat that we've seen there in September in the eastern part of the region. but really a strong difference between west to east, from cool to warm in the last 30 days. And rainfall was really quite interesting as well over the last 30 days, with the drought area, for the most part in the northern plains, hanging on to those drier conditions, as those warm colors, the reds, orange, yellows, were below average for rainfall for that period. Anything in the cooler colors, green, blue, purple, were above average for the last 30 days. So I'm sure many of you have heard of some of the flooding, especially in northern Illinois over the weekend. But there has been a pretty steady stream of events that have come through the Plains region, especially bringing some really good rainfall totals to that area. And kind of translating this into soil moisture, this is one model of soil moisture that we've access to, showing that response in the soil from the rainfall that we've seen. Again, the oranges and yellows are drier than average for this time of year. The purple color, wetter than average for this time of year. So you can kind of see that kind of streak going through from southwest to northeast across the region. And this data is a couple days old, so I don't think it's quite captured the recent heavy rainfall in northern Illinois and eastern Iowa, but surely I'm sure that would pick up pretty soon as this gets updated. Another way that we've seen a response of the environment to the both dry and wet conditions is in the streamflow, and this is looking at U.S. Geological Survey data. Anything in the blue or even black are much above average streamflow for the last 28 days, on average anyway. And I know there were some minor, maybe even moderate flood warnings in some of those rivers and streams as you look through the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Nebraska especially recently. And also in Colorado, as they had some early season snowfall and some water get through into the streamflow as well. All right, so I mentioned drought a couple times, and here is the latest drought monitor map from this morning for this central region. And quite a bit of improvement over the last month, which I'll show in the next slide. But we did see more improvement in Iowa, the Dakotas, and Montana recently, really in response to a lot of the steady rainfall and some extreme rainfall that we've seen across the region in the last few weeks. So right now across these states, just shy of 20% of the region is in some level of drought. About 2% of the region is in D3. There's no longer any D4 or exceptional drought in the region as of this week. And here's another map about the drought monitor, showing how many categories that drought monitor has changed over the last 4 weeks. Anything in the green shading has improved in the last 4 weeks. Anything in the yellow shading has degraded in the last 4 weeks. Gray has had no change. And so you can see again, the widespread improvements, 1 to 2 categories, maybe even 3 in parts of Iowa over the last 4 weeks. Given that the drought monitor typically only changes 1 category per week at the most, to have a 3 category change in a 4-week period is quite rapid improvement, and surely a reflection of those wetter conditions, as I mentioned earlier. So some of the other impacts, looking first, this is that time of year we're looking at fall freeze, and this is the climatology or median date of the first 32-degree freeze across the country. And anything in the blues typically are sometime in September. The green shadings are typically sometime in October, according to the 30-year average. I'll show the year to date so far, looking at the current fall season. a lot of the region is showing a later than average frost. You see the dark greens and light greens. Those areas had a frost just within the last week or week and a half or so, since the 1st of October, that are typically seeing that first 32-degree frost sometime in September. And then you see the areas in gray still in the southern and eastern part of the region that still have not measured a 32-degree frost yet, so they're a little bit later than usual as well. At this point in the season, you know, we don't expect a lot of major impacts with a later freeze at this point. Another story that we've seen here in the last month has been record warmth in the Midwest region. This is some data from the Midwest Regional Climate Center in Illinois, showing just high temperature records that were broken or tied in the month of September. And so you can see by the icons there, if it was a black square, they had both high maximum and minimum temperatures that were broken for that location. And so obviously a lot of record high temperatures there. A lot of areas recording over the 90s and around the 20th to 25th of September, sometime around there. Also, a lot of low temperature records were broken as far as high minimum temperatures. And not as widespread as the daytime maximums in the previous map, but certainly that warmth that we saw across that region for about 5 to 7 days is really exceptional for this late in the season. Some data to show that for the Chicago area, this is from the National Weather Service office there, September 20th to 26th, they had 7 consecutive days over 92 degrees, which is the latest occurrence of having a string that long. The previous was September of 1955. And it's just the second time on record that they've had, I believe it's more than 5 consecutive days in that temperature range. The only other previous time was during that really notable heat wave in 1988 that it was over late July, early August. So no doubt it was really an extreme event. Cedar Rapids, very similarly, the latest occurrence as far as the year's warmest 5-day stretch. So if you take the warmest 5 days of the year, even any time in the summer, that just occurred there in late September for Cedar Rapids. And again, highs in the 90s for much of that time. Also in the Chicago area, some extreme rainfall there just recently over the weekend here. This is a map from the National Weather Service office there, showing the rainfall from a 48-hour period reporting as of Sunday morning. So quite wide, and this is also the map, or sorry, the picture I showed on the opening slide about that flooding in the Naperville area. This is the same event, bringing in 4 to 8 inches, maybe even more, in some very isolated areas, widespread, 2 to 4 inches in that region. All right, in the Missouri River, not to dwell on this too much, but the update from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on October 10th shows the Missouri River in pretty good situation right now as far as the amount of water in the major reservoirs, and the red lines you see in each one of those little cups is about where they were at that time. They note that they were holding back a little bit of water to kind of lessen the burden downstream from all of that rainfall that had come across the region, but that they would increase that again to reduce the levels in the reservoir to make room for any potential flooding for later in the spring, getting ready for the winter season. All right, so La Nina is kind of the big story here for the winter season. Right now, 55 to 65% likely, and that's consistent, the same number as they were saying last month in September, most likely to develop between November and February sometime. Often, historically, La Nina has meant colder temperatures than average in the northern states and wetter than average conditions in the Ohio River Basin, maybe Great Lakes area. But I'll show you a few maps here where recent La Nina events have showed a fair bit of variability. First, looking at the current situation, this is looking at 3-month season. So on the bottom left here, SON, that's September, October, November, December, and going forward, you see a blue bar. The probability of La Nina is the blue bar at a maximum there in the December, January, February time frame. But overall, the official outlook is saying about 55 to 65% likely. We're still in ENSO neutral conditions at the current time, but a lot of indicators in the ocean and atmosphere in the tropical Pacific are pointing towards a La Nina development here over the winter. So looking at historical La Nina events, I'll spend a little bit of time here on temperature and then precipitation. So looking at 21 La Nina events since 1949 to 2012. This is kind of the composite or kind of the average. If you take all those events in the winter season, that the blue colors, blues and greens, indicate below average temperatures for those events, compared to the 1981 to 2010 average, right? But we can break this down into those events that occurred earlier, say 1949 to 1985 on the left, and then those events that occurred more recently since 1985. And you see a little bit of difference there in the temperature, in that the events that occurred earlier in the period showed more strongly that colder temperature trend, I would say, or average in the winter season. Looking just at La Nina events again, you don't see that as strongly in the more recent La Nina episodes. And another way to kind of illustrate the same point, that there's a lot of variability in each La Nina event. You know, no two act the same, right? And this is the La Nina event since 1950, looking at the temperature map for the country in each case. And a lot of differences there. Some years were really warm, some years were very cold, and some years just slightly so. And this does include strong, moderate, and weak events. So looking at all La Nina events since 1950 here in this graphic. Similarly, looking at precipitation, looking again the same 21 La Nina events since 1949. Don't see so much of precipitation connection to La Nina in the north central region, but further in the eastern part of the region around Great Lakes, Ohio, through the months of December to February, we see a wetter than average typically during those La Nina episodes. And again, to separate this out into pre-85 to post-1985, a little bit of difference there as well. You still see the area in the north central, northern plains that doesn't show a lot of connection between precipitation and La Nina, but out in the east, it's a little bit more reduced in the area that shows it has been wetter, more in the Ohio River Basin and less so in the Great Lakes region. So again, a lot of variability in the La Nina events historically, as far as above or below average rainfall in the region. And here again, these are those same La Nina events, all La Nina events since 1950 for the winter season. All right, so looking ahead, certainly La Nina will be a piece of this in the outlooks, but I'll start kind of in the near term, the next week to 2 weeks, and then venture out further into the forecast or outlook and towards the winter season. Here is to start with the 7-day precipitation forecast for the country from the Weather Prediction Center. Again, pretty Pretty low precipitation amounts, if any, in the western part of the region, but does show some rainfall out in the central and eastern part of the region. Again, nothing like what we've seen over the last week or so in northern Illinois and Iowa, but 1 to 2 inches in some of those areas. We see a pretty strong, or a relatively strong ridge over the west and a trough in the east that's kind of bringing that pattern to us. Looking ahead now, a little further, 8 to 14 days out, about 1 to 2 weeks from now, higher likelihood of warmer than average temperatures in the western 2/3 of the country, more likely cooler than average temperatures in the eastern and southeastern part of the country. But on the right, you can see pretty much the whole heart of our region is favored to be below average in precipitation for that same period, for that 8 to 14 days out. So that would be October 26th to November 1st, around there. In the outlook that was released this morning by the Climate Prediction Center for the month of November, for the next month, shows increased likelihood of warmer than average temperatures, really centered over the southwestern states, a little bit in the northeast. Our region here, for the north central and central region, it does not have a lot as far as probabilities go. There's a lot of mixed indicators in both temperature and precipitation there. So all that white area now shows equal chances of below, above, or near average for both temperature and precipitation. One exception on the precipitation side is Montana, Wyoming area, where there is an area favored for higher than average or above average precipitation in the month ahead in November. The 3-month outlook, looking at November through January, taking those 3 months kind of all together. Again, temperature on the left, precipitation on the right. The precipitation pattern first on the right, very similar to what we just saw for the November outlook. A little bit larger area of the northern Rockies, more favored to be above average precipitation. Much of the rest of our region here, equal chances of above, below, near average for precipitation for that 3-month period. On the left there, the temperature side, much of the country except for the northern tier there, Montana, Dakotas, part of Minnesota, most of the country is favored on the warmer side of things for November through January, with equal chances there in the northern states, which is kind of a transition here into their outlook for December through February, kind of the heart of the winter season now, as they're kind of trending towards or transitioning towards more of a typical La Nina pattern. As I showed in some of those slides earlier, the Montana, North Dakota area historically has seen colder than average temperatures, and that's one factor that was taken into account in this outlook as well. And then the rainfall, or precipitation rather, on the right, you see a similar historical La Nina pattern for the most part, with above average precipitation favored in the northern Rockies and Great Lakes, Ohio Basin area. So that's what we have for now. Looking into that, there are other factors that go into that, of course, but La Nina is one of the players in our winter season up here. And looking at the drought outlook for the next season ahead through the end of January, brown areas indicating that drought's likely to persist in much of those areas as we get into the winter season. That is typically our dry season up in the Dakotas and cold season. So historically, drought does not change too much up in that area. Some also improvements there in the green shading, showing some other further improvements in the rest of the region. So kind of a summary of our conditions so far. The last month or so, we've seen cooler than average temperatures in the west, warmer temperatures than average in the east, typically dry in the west and south. but very wet through kind of that center of our area here. Overall, in general, frost is later than average this season. I didn't mention too much on the rivers outside of the Missouri River, but they were running a little bit low, a little bit dry in late September, but those in the Mississippi in particular, but recent rains have really increased flows for that area, and water supply seems to be pretty good in the Missouri River at this point. Looking at the outlooks, La Nina watch is what's currently in effect. Historically, again, that's meant colder in the north and wetter in the Great Lakes Ohio Basin, but we've seen a lot of variability in that in recent years. November, again, wetter conditions favored in Montana, warmer in the southwest part of our region. And in the winter, as we are kind of anticipating at this point a transition towards colder in the northern states and wetter of the Great Lakes and Ohio Basin, according to their latest outlook. A few slides here that you can go back and see some of these links as well as we post this online, I believe tomorrow, if you want to go back and look at some of these resources. And my contact information is there at the top among several other partners here for this webinar that provided content. At this point, I think we're going to hold questions till the end, and I'll let Doug transition to the next speaker. Thanks for your attention so far.
Okay, thank you, Laura. That was great. Brad, are you getting the signal? There you go.
All right, you see me?
I see you, Brad, and why don't you just go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Doug, and thank you, Laura, for all the commentary on the weather and climate and outlooks. I'm going to take a shot at making some sense of all that strange spring, summer, and early autumn weather and show how it affected agriculture across the north central part of the United States. I've got my contact information on the front screen here. I'll show it again at the end if you miss it here. And I'm going to dive right in. Laura did mention the fact that a lot of the upper Midwest and the Central Plains experienced their first significant widespread freeze of the season on October 10th and 11th. Everything to the north and west of that bold black line experienced sub-freezing temperatures about a week ago. And the reason that's important this year is because we had some delayed crop development. So I'm going to look at that in the context first of corn. And I'm going to show a series of these crop slides starting with corn. And you'll notice that what this shows is the major and minor agricultural production regions in the U.S. in dark green and light green respectively. The yellow number in the middle of each state represents the typical amount of the U.S. production that comes from that state. So, for example, Iowa, from the years 2010 to 14, accounted for 17% of the U.S. corn production. So with that background information, we can take a look at the very latest corn yield forecast from USDA. This came out last Thursday on October 12th. And what this map reflects is the change from the previous month. So where you see blue, that's not change from last year, that's change from last month. The blue estimates are actually higher than the September 1st corn yield forecast estimates. The red numbers came in a little bit lower. And so you can see that the U.S. corn yield was actually up almost 2 bushels per acre from last month. And so some of those early test weights coming in appear to be pretty good, even in some of the drought-affected areas. And if you look at the overall U.S. number, it's not too far off from where we were last year's record. And we actually have a forecast for record yield for 2017 in a couple of states in the region, including Michigan at 168 bushels per acre and in Kentucky at 174. Now, if you look at the corn grain production number, it's come up a little bit with that boost in yield expectation, and if realized, it would be number 2 all-time on the list of U.S. corn production numbers. Now, drought was an issue certainly for parts of the Midwest during the 2017 growing season, particularly across some of the far western and northwestern corn production areas. As you move into the Dakotas, But even there, we did see some late season rain that did bring some improvement in condition. And it was only very late in the season we saw some deterioration across states like Iowa and Illinois into Indiana. And so we did see some drought developing late in the season there. Overall, at this point, we only have 9% of the corn production area experiencing drought as of October 10th. And during the growing season, we varied a little bit from 0%, no drought whatsoever in the corn production areas back in May, to a seasonal high of about 1/6 of the crop of the production area in drought as we moved into August. Now, looking at a very simple linear corn condition index, just looking at a weighting scale, looking at excellent, good, fair, poor, and very poor, and weighting at 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, you can see that this year's corn condition numbers came in lower than each of the previous 3 years, and so lower than any time since 2013 when we were still emerging from the great drought of 2012. But even with those lower conditions, a couple of things to note. Number one is we saw improving conditions late in the year. Some of that was due to those improvements in the western production areas like the Dakotas. And the other thing is that we didn't see really any decline late in the year, despite some incipient dryness and drought across the central, primarily the central Corn Belt. Now, looking at the current corn conditions, overall, things are looking pretty good. The nation as a whole, we've got almost 2/3 of the corn currently rated in good to excellent condition, but that's 9 percentage points below where we were at this time a year ago when we set both yield and production record numbers. If you look at the individual states, just about every state in the central region, and I've circled those areas in red just so you can kind of draw your eye to the area that we're focusing on today, other than Colorado and Kentucky, every other state has a lower condition than this time a year ago, some fairly significant like Illinois, which 83% good to excellent a year ago, now 63% this year. So not a terrible year, but we did have issues, the drought in the north and west areas, and we had a late planting in parts of the east followed by erratic rainfall, so a less than ideal year, but again, still not a terrible year by any stretch. Now, we did talk about that corn maturity with regard to that freeze. And you see that by October 15th, in some of the freeze-affected states, we only had achieved full corn maturity in 80% of the crop in North Dakota, 73% in Colorado. And so that is a bit of a concern. However, almost all that corn, virtually all of it, had dented. So the fact that we were somewhere between dent and full maturity suggests that we may have lost just a smidgen of yield production potential. But we certainly did not lose any of that corn outright, as if it had been still in dough stage, for example, and we might have turned it to mush with a freeze. In this case, we don't lose it, but we might take just a little bit of the top off of the yield potential in some of those freeze-affected areas where we had not achieved full maturity. The harvest, Laura mentioned some of those heavy rains that we had seen until a couple of weeks ago in the upper Midwest, and between the late maturity and the wet weather that we saw in late September into early October, that really got the harvest off to a delayed start, and you can really see those low harvest numbers to this point, mid-October, less than 10% harvested in Minnesota and North Dakota. Minnesota, that's 31 percentage points behind the 5-year average pace, and nationally we are only at 28% harvested, and 47% is the 5-year average. Just a quick summary of those corn conditions. Certainly an imperfect year for corn, especially with regard to drought in the far upper Midwest and the late planting and erratic rainfall in the eastern Corn Belt. Pockets of dryness also in Illinois and Iowa and other states in the middle part of the Corn Belt. Still, with all that, we could realize record high corn production in Kentucky and Michigan, and we could realize the second highest corn yield and production numbers on record for the U.S. As I mentioned, drought affected anywhere from 0 to about 1/6 of the production area during the growing season, and currently 65% good to excellent. Shifting to soybeans, there's your major production areas, very similar to corn, except for that little ribbon of soybeans that goes southward through the delta. And you can see that unlike corn, we actually saw some reductions in the forecast yield numbers for many Midwestern states between September 1st and October 1st in the crop production report. Nothing major, but we took away a bushel here and a bushel there. And overall, just a little less than half a bushel decline month over month. But we're still looking at the potential for record yields in states like Missouri and Kentucky. Soybean production, largely on the strength of a very large, record large planted area, should easily achieve a record production for the U.S. for 2017. Soybean acres considerably above corn acres in 2017. Not much to say here. The numbers are going to be very similar to what we saw with the corn. Currently 9% of the soybean area in drought. We saw the exact same spread, anywhere from 0% in drought back in May to a high of 16% of the production area in drought during a couple of weeks in August. And soybean condition more or less mirroring the corn condition. We did see our lowest overall soybean condition during the latter portion of the growing season since 2013 and below each of the last 3 years. And soybean conditions, like corn, coming in considerably lower than what we saw a year ago. You notice that the states bordering the Mississippi River tended to fare better than the far western areas where we had the drought impacts and the eastern areas where we had the late planting and erratic rainfall patterns. Soybeans, unlike corn, largely caught up to the normal pace of development during that late September warmth that Laura was talking about. So we're pretty much right on par with soybeans dropping leaves, which puts the crop out of any frost danger at this point. And the harvest progress, we've done pretty well in some of the eastern areas where they got off to a very quick harvest start with the dry weather in late September. And at the same time, that was when we were getting the heavy rains in the upper Midwest. We have not caught up from that. I suspect this week will go pretty well because we've seen a nice, dry, warm week with a warming trend across the upper Midwest. But coming into this week, as of October 15th, at least 30 percentage points behind the 5-year average harvest pace in South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, and Minnesota. Getting into some of the soybean highlights, also an imperfect year for soybeans, but as I mentioned, states bordering the Mississippi tended to do better. We've got that forecast for record high production in those 2 states in the south part of the region, and we should easily achieve a production record this year with 4.43, that should be billion bushels, and drought affected anywhere from 0 to 1/6 of the soybean production area, and currently 61% of the crop rated good to excellent, just a little bit lower than the corn numbers. Other highlights, and I will step through each of these crops in no particular order, but first of all, the highlights. Important to note that spring wheat was a disastrous year for the spring wheat production area. It was in fact the worst year since the drought of 1988, and we saw a little bit of harvested area down, but a lot of the production loss that you see here on the screen was due to the drought, especially from the western Dakotas westward. We also had a big reduction in the sunflower production. A good chunk of that comes from the Dakotas. We saw production down 32% from last year. We've seen the rain delaying early harvest activities, and of that 32%, only a portion of that was accounted for by the lower harvested area. We do have winter wheat to talk about, and I'll get to that in a couple of slides from now. But in particular, we have seen some significant planting delays up until recently across the Central Plains, particularly Kansas, which is the #1 production state for winter wheat. Sugar beet harvest well underway, production down just a smidgen from last year, 3%. We did have some drought impacts on the sorghum crop, partly due to drought and partly due to a lower acreage. So you can kind of see the spread there. And then, of course, we had a huge rangeland and pasture issue in the Dakotas westward, and to a lesser degree spreading into states like Iowa and Illinois as things really browned out quite a bit. Some of the hardest hit areas, the Dakotas, we may not realize much new grass growth until we get into at least the spring of 2018 or beyond due to the timing, the late timing of the drought relief across the Dakotas. Just again, touching on each of these quickly, spring wheat, by far and away, most of the crop comes from the northern plains. And with that said, you can see the condition being far below the other drought years of the last couple of decades, 1997, 2002, 2006. Even with some late rains, it really came too late to appreciably help the crop. And I put the best year on top just as a reference mark for that condition. At this time, even with the improvement that we've seen across the northern plains, we still have more than half of the spring wheat production area in drought. And if you look at the time series, at one point we had more than 4/5 of the production area in drought, showing just how serious things got. And even at the higher end drought, the D3s and D4s, substantial acreage was affected by truly a crippling drought during the summer months. I mentioned sunflowers. Wet weather has postponed the start of the harvest, so we're getting off to a late start. All states, all four, Colorado, Kansas, and the Dakotas. Speaking of winter wheat, again, I mentioned Kansas being the #1 wheat production state historically, almost always. And we see very delayed planting there. What happened in some cases was it was too dry initially, that delayed planting, and then the rain started and wouldn't stop. So it's been tough to get back into the field to get that planting started again. It's getting pretty late in the year, so a little bit of concern about getting that crop up and established before it turns too cold for any further wheat or grass development. And Kansas, again, kind of sticking out like a sore thumb on the emergence picture. Just a quarter of the crop emerged by mid-October, and that's well behind the 5-year average of 46%. And just to mention sugar beets, a lot of the concentration of sugar beets coming from the Red River Valley, also in Michigan. And with that crop, despite some of the weather challenges, harvest progress is pretty much on par in all of the major production states. And I did want to just briefly mention sorghum. We had some challenges with that crop as well. Most of the crop comes from either Kansas or to the south in Texas. But we did have significant drought impacts on sorghum in South Dakota. And we see, even though the overall U.S. crop is 65% good to excellent, look at South Dakota. This is a current number, just 23% good to excellent. And Kansas, the #1 state, only at 58%, also seeing some issues in Illinois at 45% good to excellent. Sorghum maturity lagging a bit in many of our central region states, including South Dakota. And the harvest progress delayed by the late maturity as well as some adverse weather conditions over the last couple of weeks. And finally, I will mention that pasture and range, despite some of the recent rainfall, we have been very slow to recover with those rains just coming too late for much new grass growth in states like especially North Dakota and South Dakota. If you compare those numbers from last year, tremendously lower. North Dakota, for example, just 13% of the range in pasture rated good to excellent in mid-October compared to 53% a year ago. And some of those impacts, as I mentioned earlier, spreading across into Iowa and Illinois and even into Michigan and Indiana, substantially lower conditions than this time a year ago. And one specialty crop mentioned here, the cherries. Almost all, about 2/3 of the tart cherries come from Michigan. And we did have a bit of an off year. Some of that was due to a May freeze event, but certainly below the banner year of 2016 when we had more than 222 million pounds of tart cherries coming out of Michigan, kind of back to where we were a couple of years ago in 2015. And with that, I think we can open things up to questions for me or Laura, and I'll turn it back over to Doug.
Thank you very much, Brad. That was a good all-encompassing talk. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions, and if anybody else has any questions or if they get spurred on by the questions that we're going to answer here, feel free to either you can raise your hand and I can sort of allow you to speak or whatever. But we'll start with a question from Ben Diamond. And this is one that I'm going to have a little trouble answering, so I'm hoping either Dennis Toddy, who's also on the phone, or Laura, or even you, Brad, can help answer it. And the question is, how is soil moisture modeled? We showed that soil moisture view or graphic up there a little earlier. The one thing I do know is it has some limitations. The modeling has limitations because there is a relatively sparse network of soil moisture monitoring out there, so it's hard to compare to reality sometimes. But in terms of, obviously not such a scientific analysis, but does anybody want to sort of chime in on how soil moisture is modeled?
Yeah, Doug, this is Dennis. I'll take a first crack at it, and people can kibitz afterwards. There's multiple different ways of doing it. There's simpler ways, like the Climate Prediction Center, which we haven't shown, which is called the Leaky bucket model. Basically, it does some assessment of how much precipitation fell over an area. It assesses a little bit about where else that goes in the way of soil moisture being used by plants, and then some of it is lost to the soil. It's called the Leaky bucket model. There's another one called the NLDAS. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. It's a land data assimilation system. Basically, it tries to model all the components of rainfall, how much of that rainfall infiltrates, how much of it runs off, how much it is used by crop, because it's a fairly complicated system and really quite difficult to assess. So that's why you always have to take soil moisture models with something of a grain of salt. And then there's a number of different ways that can be done based on the different kinds of models.
So there's your sort of, I would say incomplete, but good enough description of how to answer that question. The other question we had, this is really for Brad, is could you discuss why the crop conditions for corn and soybeans improved later in the growing season?
Sure. Yeah. The whole thing about crop conditions from USDA NASS is, I think, sometimes a little bit of a chicken or egg argument. Sometimes I get the feeling, and this is not a knock on the process whatsoever, but if reports are coming in that yields are coming in a little bit better than what we think, maybe folks are going to be inclined to say, well, maybe the condition's a little better than we thought, or vice versa. If things are coming in a little bit worse than they look, there's only so much you can do with a condition report. A lot of those probably are windshield surveys, or at least side of the field surveys. And for whatever reason, conditions are running a little bit lower than what we seem to be seeing in terms of yield potential this year. So it's a very complex process, and there might be a little bit of psychology involved in it. Whatever the case, it seems like corn and soybean conditions have been down a little bit this year, but the overall final output may be a little bit better than what those conditions seem to indicate.
Brad, people should also remember too that soybeans can adapt to late season moisture or less stressful conditions and respond to that. Particularly soybeans in August can do that, and maybe with the late development this year, even in the early part of September. Corn typically doesn't do that, so that's kind of an odd one why the corn responded as much as it did, but certainly it's not, with soybeans would not be that much of a surprise.
Absolutely, yeah. We've seen several instances of very late rains helping soybeans in recent years, including Hurricane Isaac remnants in 2012. So that's not all that unusual, but yeah, corn's a little bit of a mystery, and maybe it just, from a field survey or a road survey, it just wasn't looking as good, but we're still going to get, more robust weights than we expected.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Jerry Oster has a question. Hold on a second. Let's see. Hold on just a second. Yeah, trying to figure out my question thing here. Can we expect to see more cold air sliding down from Canada in the next few weeks and possibly bring snow with it? That's kind of a short-term question in terms of the weather, I guess. Actually, go back to your 2-week outlook real quick. You know, one thing that I'll say generally, Jerry, is that during these, this is if this does happen to be a La Nina winter, this is the prognosis looks like it'll be a relatively weak one. That La Nina doesn't necessarily mean that we know all the answers in terms of it's going to be colder to the north and warmer to the south and equally wetter sort of in those areas that Laura mentioned and drier to the south. There are so many other interactions with short-term, I guess you'd call them short-term, we call them teleconnections or indices that can really play a big part in our weather. But what it does indicate, the La Nina conditions indicates that it is more likely that you'll have a few more cold plunges. Now, in terms of timing on when the first one is going to be or anything like that, and in terms of snow, that's a really tough question. So depending upon, it also depends on where you are. That's gonna play a major part. One thing we didn't put in this presentation was anything about the Great Lakes, and and Laura's rolling her eyes at me saying, "Oh gosh, I forgot that." But conditions in the Great Lakes means that the water is, I believe, warmer than normal this year, which tends to allow more lake effect snow later in the year when the real cold air comes. If you look at these maps, you'll see that the end of October, really for the end of October, there's nothing sort of indicating any sort of major snowstorm. There is an indication of some colder air coming down over the next few days into next week or weekend, but really no major Arctic or even polar plunges for that matter. And I know we have Barb on the phone, so we do have a sort of weather connection if she would like to chime in on that note and predict the first snow for the region. I certainly would let her do that. But in terms, Barb, is that you?
Yeah, that's me. No, I think I'm going to pass on predicting first freezes, first frosts, and first snow anywhere.
Yeah, it's a tough question, Jerry. So you know, stay tuned, I guess you'd say. We don't normally see those big snowstorms for a bit longer. Obviously, they can happen as early as September in some places in this area, but there's nothing sort of on the radar, so to speak, that is showing that kind of thing happening.
Doug, it's an easy question. We've had our first snows in some of our areas already.
Well, I guess so.
Doug, I would say to Jerry's comment, certainly there's more chances for cold outbreaks than we've had so far this fall. The models are hinting at a couple more breaks and some cold outbreaks. That's just climatology. We're going to see some more of those. This warmth will not continue unabated, but exactly when, yes, is a bit difficult to say.
Thank you, Dennis. We do have a comment from Bryce who says, regarding corn improvement this week, there's a suggestion that some of the poorer crops were cut for silage, and thus remaining stands look better. Any comments on that? No comments. Okay. I don't know if the silage outlook is for better or for worse. So Jerry, no Halloween blizzard this year unless Barb wants to go way out on a limb. But I'll leave that up to Barb. One thing we do want to talk just a little bit about are these maps. I hope they weren't too confusing to you. Basically, what we were trying to convey here was the difference between the way La Nina has materialized over the U.S. Prior to 1985 and post 1985. These are actually taken from it's taken from a presentation that the Climate Prediction Center provided recently, and it's a pretty interesting graphic in that, you know, before 1985, when you had a La Nina conditions, and this blends all strengths of La Ninas. There are all kinds. There are weak ones, there are strong ones, there are moderate ones. But this sort of blends them all together and shows sort of the depth, if you will, or the greater probability of colder air. Used to be, the probability was stronger in the past than it has been since 1985, affecting parts of the U.S. And you also have seen parts of the southern part of the U.S. sort of the warmth, warmer than normal conditions over December. Again, this is December, January, February, expand a little bit further north. And again, these are general, and these are sort of blended together, many years blended, or several episodes blended together. So, and then the precipitation one, if you want to flip to that real quick, also shows a trend from sort of less coverage, as Laura said, less coverage over the Ohio and in the deep south and even into the northeast in terms of precipitation being above normal recently, as opposed to what it was in the past. And I don't really have a major comment on this other than the temperature probably is tied to the trend in global temperatures in terms of it being warmer, especially in the winter in this neck of the woods. Any other comments on that note or La Nina in general anybody would like to make? Chip Zimmer. Okay, hold on. Okay. I think we have another comment or question if I can find it. Here we go. Oh, Chip Zimmer says there's a slight chance for some snow in the mountains of southeast Kentucky next week. I guess with that cold plunge coming down. So there you go. Hardly a blizzard, but we'll see. We'll see what we can get out of it for the snow lovers out there. Any other questions or comments? All right, we will conclude this this presentation. I thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Barb. We will be back with a mystery presenter in November. Until then, have a good month.